everybody. This is Dr. Kip Pietrantonio, and with me,
Dr. Ryan McDermott.
And we are doing our first inaugural episode of the Psychology of Men show. Today we are going to be talking about a very hot topic that's been going on in the news the last couple of weeks, which is this Gillette razors commercial where it's essentially criticizing masculinity or criticizing men and telling men that they can do better, that we as men can do better. So Ryan and I are going to be going through and kind of breaking down the commercial a little bit, talking about some key points. There's been a lot of criticism of this commercial already. If you haven't seen the commercial, please go ahead and check it out. I'll put a link down in the description. First, let me just ask you this. What was your initial reaction when kind of hearing the news about this? I mean, it was kind of all over social media. I imagine for you as a masculinity researcher, you're like taking a deep breath, right? So, but what was your initial reaction to seeing the commercial?
You know, I was kind of surprised by it at first. Watching it the first time around, I didn't really get it at first, partly because I was watching it in a busy environment. I wasn't really paying attention. But once I really sat down and looked at the commercial, I thought, there's a lot to unpack here. So I'm really excited to talk about this with you today.
Right. I think my reaction was a little bit more pessimistic going in, because to me, whenever I see something like this, I'm really skeptical, because it kind of feels like I heard this term like social justice profiteering the other day, which I think is like a pretty interesting term, which is like essentially taking a civil rights issue or a human rights issue and making it like, hey, this corporation, like in this case Procter and Gamble, who owns Gillette, can now make a profit off of like the Me Too movement, or make a profit off like what's popular in feminism currently, which kind of feels icky to me. So right away when I saw like Gillette has a commercial about sexual harassment, I was like, kind of cringed right off the bat. So, and when you've thought about Gillette traditionally, Ryan, what comes to mind? Because I always think of like the high definition graphic of like 50, it's like super close in on somebody's beard, like it's like 10 different blades shaving somebody's face, and there's like the aloe patch and everything going through, and like showing why you need 8 different like blades in a singular razor. Like that's what I think of when I think of Gillette as a brand. So that, I mean, I don't know what you think of traditionally.
I kind of think of the tagline, you know, best a man can get. Just because that jingle kind of got stuck in my head when I was a kid. My dad always shaved. Like I used to watch him shave. It's kind of like a way of imparting masculinity in a strange way, watching your dad shave, you know, learning how to shave from your dad. So I think there is definitely some like manhood pieces to it. But yeah, the massive razors with like 12 different blades or whatever, and it kind of cracks me up a little bit. There's a great SNL skit where Will Ferrell goes over the different blades. He's like, the first one cuts you even closer, and by the end of it, he has like no face. It's pretty good.
That's so funny. Yeah, I remember it was like the Mach 3, or I don't even know if that was Gillette or whatever, but I remember like a lot of people got that for Christmas.
Well, just a little the name Mach 3. Let's unpack that for a second. Talk about pandering to masculinity. Right. It's a razor blade. It's not a jet engine. So, you know, just some thoughts there.
Yeah, and I think did the Mach 3 come after like the Mach 2? Was there a Mach 1, Mach 2, and like, because I remember when they added the third blade. That was a big deal. And as a Italian American and a hairy man, it was actually a big deal for me. It's funny you said that, like remembering like shaving with your father. It's like I was so young when I started shaving that I don't even like remember that. I think I was like 5th grade. So
I started last week.
Anyway, yeah. So okay. So anyway, let's get into this commercial a little bit. The kind of first scene that I really wanted to talk about is there's a scene at the beginning where it's showing like basically what I would say is cyberbullying. So it's showing like a mother, it looks like she's watching like a news station. She's hearing about all these different like kind of toxic masculinity and the Me Too movement, everything. And it cuts to her, and she's basically holding her son like this with her hand, like, and he's crying. Right. And then all around her is like text bubbles of like calling the kid like a sissy and a freak and other things. And I thought that was really interesting because I thought it really hit right on one of the key places where toxic masculinity still lives. I think oftentimes, and in this commercial too, there's this almost cartoonish version of masculinity that gets critiqued, where it's like the boys, I mean, they literally say it in the commercial, like the boys will be boys,
Yeah.
and like as if everybody's just a total jerk and like a complete slave to like this kind of stereotypical masculinity, when I think
Right.
things are like more subtle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, but where I don't think that occurs is on the internet, because I still think toxic masculinity exists in its like purest, grossest, ickiest form online. And if you want to, you can find like the most sexist, grotesque things just in
Yeah.
almost in any you go to any female YouTuber's comments,
Yeah.
and it's just like thing after thing after thing after thing, stuff that I think is worse than has ever existed in real life.
Right.
And so that to me was like a very pressing scene, because I've just counseled enough kids who have been like bullied online in middle school, and it's so scarring to them. And
Right.
I don't know if you have any reactions or thoughts on that.
I think there's a lot to unpack there. I really like your analysis of how toxic masculinity lives on the internet. You said something about how maybe it's more there than it was in real life.
Hmm.
I think I may want to push back on a little bit. I think that the internet allows guys to do it with impunity to some degree, and
Yeah.
so it's always been there. To especially you've worked with clients, for instance, who have had that bullying experience. You know, I think that bullying is related to toxic masculinity in the sense that it's about dominance and power and control. But it's important
Hmm.
to note, and I'm sure critics will note this in the comments of this video in particular, that women can do those things too, you know.
Hmm.
And so maybe just for our viewers who are coming to this maybe without an academic understanding of this construct, just a brief review of sex versus gender might be really important just for a second.
Okay.
Um, just sex is what you're born with, it's your biology. Gender, of course, is the culture of either being a male or female in this society. And it has
Hmm.
changed. Back in the 1920s and 30s, pink was a very masculine color. That is not the case anymore. That's just one example of how it's changed. But this bullying piece has traditionally been male dominated. And I do think that unfortunately a lot of boys get a pass as kind of like a rite of passage, if you will, that
Hmm.
you have to stand up to the bully. I mean, I can actually remember seeing after school specials where the kid stood up to the bully. He got his butt kicked, but it
Hmm.
was like this rite of passage. You know,
Right.
and I think what this commercial is saying, and what a lot of researchers in masculinity are saying, is that men can do better, and that this is part of the culture of masculinity that we can change. We're not changing men; we're changing the
Hmm.
culture of what it means to be a man.
Within that though, Ryan, do you think that the reason that the toxic masculinity, you're saying it's always been there, but what do you think has traditionally suppressed it from existing like in real life to the extent maybe it exists on the internet?
Well, when you attack someone on the internet, you don't see them, right? So there's an
Right.
empathy kind of barrier that happens in real life. Most
Hmm.
people are not psychopaths. Most
Right.
people can know, hey, if I do this to somebody, they're going to hurt and I'm going to probably feel bad or at least suffer consequences,
Hmm.
right? So there's I think it's called inhibitory anxiety that happens in real life that just we don't see on the internet. But that kind of makes you wonder then, is it sort of like the internet is the equivalent to having a few beers? You know, you suddenly
Right.
let your true self out, and there's some pretty disturbing stuff on there. And you mentioned the YouTube comments about any feminist stuff out there, and my goodness, you are absolutely right.
And not even just feminists. I think just any video of a female doing anything. You know what
Oh
I mean?
gosh, yeah, at some point
I
there's something sexist and misogynist in the comments.
right. And I think what happens is like, and I think this contributes to like maybe the belief or some of the beliefs around men, is those comments tend to get the most airtime, quote unquote, or
Yeah.
like seen, versus like the vast majority of men who probably watch it and don't ever comment or don't ever read the comments. But because it's like a couple bad players, tend to make everybody look like the worst possible people. And of course, if you're the person who's on the other end of that comment, you're like, what is wrong with people? You like think they're crazy. But anyway, Ryan,
Yeah.
let's keep moving. I want to move on to the next thing. I think most powerful scene is this "boys will be boys"
Mm.
section, and I'm gonna let you actually describe that a little bit.
Right. So this is a scene in the advertisement where there's a long line of men barbecuing. And what's happening at the barbecue is one child is beating up another child, and the men are watching this unfold, and they all kind of say in unison or kind of, over each other, boys will be boys, boys will be boys, like a mantra almost.
Excuses.
Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys.
But something finally changed.
And at the same time, the narrator is pointing out that there are the same old excuses are not going to work anymore.
Right. Right. So I think, okay, so let me just play devil's advocate here for a second, Ryan. I think that a lot of people would say that this is the critique of millennials in general, that by not letting people kind of go through this toughening process of like maybe losing, like walking home after you got your nose punched after you said something, and like having to go and like, kind of walk away with your tail between your legs. What that teaches somebody is that they like that's what losing is, and it's important to get back up on your horse kind of afterwards, versus the alternative ideology of like no one ever gets hurt, everybody wins, everybody gets a trophy. So what would you say about that?
I had not thought about that, but it seems, I mean, if you just look at the criticisms of the guy, sorry, I went somewhere else there for a second, of the Gillette commercial, it seems to me as though there's kind of this sort of like, well, men are supposed to be tough and just kind of tough it out, right? This boys will be boys thing works kind of both ways. It works to minimize any responsibility for changing, but it also works to sort of essentialize masculinity from a biological perspective. That's why I talked about sex and gender. I think it's so important to think about that distinction, because that boys will be boys comment, what it does is it forces people to kind of say, oh, well, that's just how men are born that way. Like that's the inherent underlying logic that's playing out there. But more specific to your point about millennials, we really don't know what the impact of the participation trophy generation will be and what that does. I know some researchers here who swear that it's making people less gritty, if you will. They're unable to handle failure and defeat, and that's part of why they drop out of college, for instance.
Right.
But to tie that to masculinity, and I mean, I think it's an apt criticism in the sense that masculinity has been connected to toughness, and the idea being there is that you can handle some failure. But what's happening in that video is the kid's getting beaten up, and I mean, that's what we're trying to say. I think that, and we're probably jumping ahead here a little bit to the bystander portion of this video, but there's a strong kind of men need to step up and stop this cycle. One other thing I want to say about that cycle idea, that was an artistic attempt to illustrate the cycle by showing men going on for miles and miles and miles to illustrate the generational effects here, or just the fact that many, many men are doing this. But I think that's part of why this commercial rubs some guys the wrong way. If they don't understand the artistic component of it, they might be thinking, well, that's kind of impugning all men. And actually, in some ways, the commercial did get it wrong in the sense that most men don't do this stuff, actually. I can tell you that with research certainty. So to say that some men are already doing it, they should have said most men are doing it. But a small number of men get away with it because we allow them.
Right. Yeah, I think that's probably like the key criticism there, like boiled down to it. I also, let me say this. I think there's kind of two different versions of criticism of this. I think one is like the far right or alt-right's like criticism of this, that this is just another like let's sissify men, and if we don't let men, like it is literally like the boys will be boys like approach to this.
Ironically,
and, like,
yes.
Yeah, like, and I've literally heard like on podcasts and other YouTuber responses to this, people being like, well, men stormed the beaches of Normandy, and men are like went to the moon, and men, as if like no women helped with that process in any way, shape, or form. But like that there's this kind of hardcore like everything great that's ever happened has been done by men, so don't mess with it. Then I think there's probably like the other part of resistance, which is probably the more centrist kind of middle of the road like pushback on the commercial, which is just like, yeah, it felt a little shaming kind of at the like, which didn't feel good. And I don't really feel like I'm the guy at the barbecue looking at a kid getting the like crap beat out of him going like, yeah, well, this is probably good for him.
Yeah,
I
that's a good point.
I don't really know that guy exists in like a regular. That's what I mean. Like it's like this cartoonish form of masculinity that people critique that doesn't necessarily exist. And I think it somewhat exists in the like sexual harassment piece where, and we'll get into the bystander intervention piece. We might as well just flow right into it, where there's this woman is leaving this restaurant, and this guy, he reminds me of like in the 1930s, like Looney Tunes commercials, like there's the wolf whose like tongue rolls out of his mouth and like flops on the table. And he's like, sees the woman walk out and he like chases her down the street, and then his friend comes in and is like, bro, not cool, not cool, not cool. And I'm not denying anybody. I guarantee there are guys who have done that. I just think it's like one very like mean-spirited kind of jerk of a guy with very little insight about himself who's doing that. And like 9 out of 10 guys who watch that would be like, what are you doing? Like, that's so weird and gross and creepy. But unfortunately, again, I think there's like this one guy who kind of makes like he kind of like ruins it for everybody a little bit. So
yeah, it's hard to say, is that masculinity that caused that guy to do the terrible thing? Like, is it the culture of masculinity that caused them to do that? I personally question that a little bit, because I mentioned most people are not psychopaths. Most people are not doing these kind of horrible things. Now, on the other hand, though, you got to recognize we're two dudes talking about this. We don't have a female perspective on this show yet, which we will eventually, I'm sure. But the fact is that just talking to my wife, like, she gets catcalled all the time, you know, and it's like, I certainly don't have that happen to me. Although one time we were at Division 51 dinner, and there were these women who were trying to get us to ride in their pedicabs. And they were like, hey, good looking, hey, hot buns, and all this stuff. And it was really uncomfortable, you know, and we all remarked about it. And then we all joked about how we were remarking about it, you know, and, but yeah, that's kind of what a lot of women, especially very attractive women, have to do there. But, you know,
well, hold on, Ryan. Let's stick with that for a second, because this is where I think there's a problem with the bystander intervention piece. Because usually when this kind of thing happens, it's not my best friend doing it to somebody. It's some other guy across the street yelling. Like, I'm with a big group of people and we're walking the street, and then somebody across the street yells. So as a person, like, I mean, I can of course check in with my female friends or my, you know, male friends who maybe got catcalled, but like, if I yell back at that guy, there's a potential for conflict there. And as a guy, I'm going to feel like this intense need to, like, I have to like stand up for myself and like defend the group in some way, shape, or form. And so, like, I think a lot of guys, like you said, it was really uncomfortable and you guys kind of just walked into the restaurant. That's what I think most people do, is because they're like, I don't want to yell. Like, I don't know if this guy's crazy. I don't know if the guy has a knife. I don't know if he's like going to come over here and like try to punch somebody. So we're just going to kind of like take the high road and just ignore him. And like try to go into the restaurant together. Like, that to me is like more realistic of what tends to happen in these situations. So like this bystander intervention of like, you should jump out. The one place I can see that happening is at like a college party, where I think a guy can grab another,
especially around sexual assault. Sorry to interrupt.
Exactly. No, that's exactly right. That's exactly where I was heading with that. So, but anyway, okay. So that's kind of what I was thinking in terms of like that part of it, I guess, of the commercial. So.
Let me just say one more thing about that, if I may. I think that you're absolutely right. Like the bystander scenario there was a little unrealistic. And I do agree that we need to be addressing bystander intervention for sexual assault. It's actually one of the most evidence-based ways of reducing sexual assault. I wonder if maybe what they were trying to portray is that if we were to change the culture of masculinity, that this will end. And so like somewhere, that dude has a friend, you know what I mean? And that friend might be like, hey, that's not okay. Even if it's not like for the majority of us guys who are more middle road masculinity, healthy masculinity in some ways, then, you know, maybe it's not us, it's not our friend, but that guy has a friend somewhere.
I agree with that. I just think you have to address these things in a more like in the more subtle, realistic way in which they occur.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like I think about like, okay, most guys, for example, don't engage in domestic violence, right? Like most guys aren't like literally getting in like fist matches or like fighting physically with like their partner, right? But I think what happens is a lot of guys get really angry, they yell, they say things that are mean-spirited,
Yeah.
right? They like there's like an intensity of violence there, even if the saying itself isn't there. So to me, that's where like I would love to see like, hey, let's talk about that piece,
Right.
which is something I think happens to even like really nice guys, good guys, when people get into like an intense fight with their partner, right? And that's where I think like that to me would be a more realistic approach to this,
Yeah.
as opposed to like let's have this cartoonish example of
Right.
like an extreme case. And I get that they're trying to illustrate something in a commercial, but I just think there's more subtle ways of going after this stuff. And I think if you can aim your intervention at those kind of situations, you actually can make a dent in like toxic masculinity or, you know, violence or sexual assault or whatever. But I think when you make it like this kind of cartoonish big picture, it's just you're not. I think the guys who hate it are going to shut it down, and the
Yeah.
guys who are like already on board are already on board, and
That's
you're
a
not
great
really
point.
speaking to that middle crowd.
That's a great point, because the more I think about it, those few scenes were almost like caricatures of men, like you were saying, so like cartoonish. Like,
Mhm.
I mean, it really that really is a nice way to think about it, and like a stereotype. And I think that maybe men are reacting to this sort of stereotype, which, you know, a lot of people it doesn't fit for them, and that's partly where
Mhm.
the outrage comes from. And so you're right, by doing it in such a uh, intense, I can't figure out a word for what I'm trying to say right now, but such an intense way, then
Mhm.
what they do is they isolate the people who might be on the fence. And all they do is they just kind of reinforce the camps of the people who already hate this and the people who are already on board with it. It's a great
Mhm.
point.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to say I'm not out here trying to deny anybody's experience. I guarantee there's like the worst kind of guys out there who have done the worst kinds of things. I've heard
Oh,
many
yeah.
stories in my job of that happening, but I just don't think that this is the right way always to go about it. That being said, I think
Yeah.
overall I really appreciated the commercial by the end of it. Like my fourth or fifth viewing, I remember just thinking like, oh, this like 99% of this is positive. And
Yeah.
it's so obvious to me that the critiques of it come from like a very weak guys with very weak egos.
Mm,
You
yeah.
know what I mean? Are like really offended by this.
Yes. So this kind of gets into some of my research interests, but part of what we see driving rigid adherence to certain male role norms, which some of the media calls them toxic masculinity, some other people call them toxic masculinity. I prefer traditional masculinity because it illustrates where they're from in terms of prior to the 1960s. But when they're taken to an extreme, they cause problems, and they're not really taken to an extreme unless you're pretty rigid in it. If you look
Mhm.
at the item response analyses of different items and measure these things, you see that it's really the guys that are very rigid in it that are causing most of these correlations that we see. And
Mhm.
so, from that perspective, what you need to be less rigid in some things, you need to be comfortable with it. You need to be less insecure about it. And
Mhm.
I think for a lot of these guys who are, you know, reacting to the Gillette commercial, and it's kind of they feel like it's attacking themselves, and you know maybe start to evaluate what are you saying about yourself and your masculinity, as one YouTuber put it, I mean a blogger put it, if you get super offended when someone asks you just to be nicer, you
Mhm.
need to kind of evaluate what that means about yourself.
Right. I also think there's just like a pile-on effect for people that this is just the latest like attack on traditional conservatism in
Yeah,
America. And so
yeah.
it's like this, you know, this is the latest thing that they're going after. Here's, you know, so let's wrap it up here, Ryan. So what do you all think out there in YouTube world? What do you think about the commercial? What are your thoughts on it? What do you think? What do me and Ryan have right? What do we have terribly wrong? Let us know down in the comments below. And I think that's the end of our show for today. What do you think, Ryan?
Sounds good to me. I think we've hit everything we want to say, and thanks so much for organizing this.
Oh, absolutely. All right, so we will talk to you later. Subscribe. This is the Psychology of Men show. I am Dr. Kip Pietrantonio.
Ryan McDermott.
All right. See you later.